thank you, Peter, particularly. MDB Futures is an important component of our work, and Peter was saying, oh, it may not be a big audience, and I have to say I'm delighted at small audiences these days, because there was a time not long ago when being greeted by 12,000 people on the outskirts of Griffith wasn't necessarily a fun thing to do. So I think the size of the audience is in some measure a way in which a lot of the heat's dissipated from this debate. I think there are probably three reasons for that in sort of roughly equal measure. The first one is, in my view, obviously the fact that a great deal has changed since the early days of the guide, the sort of the philosophical underpinnings that were there behind the guide and what exists now are both very different products. And of course, the second reason why there's not as much heat now is, I think, a bit of time has passed. Claims that the sky would fall, that towns would close, are not proving to be the case, and indeed, in many cases, there is evidence that people are keen to move forward. And of course, the third reason, I think one of the critical reasons, at a time of great political uncertainty in the Australian circumstance with hung parliaments and things like that, was the emphatic show of bipartisan support and political leadership demonstrated not just by Tony Burke but by people such as Simon Birmingham, people such as Barnaby Joyce, who both could have played merry hell with the work of the plan in the Senate, and of course importantly, reminiscent of work I did with John Anderson back on the NWI, the State Victorian Minister Peter Walsh, who along with Minister Burke formed a terrific coalition of determination to do something good, and I think they've achieved. But I think that vote in the Parliament was a signal to the Australian community that when you can have a vote of 95-5, near enough unanimous for the purposes of such a fraught policy conversation, the government's coalition, the Parliament of Australia, were really saying it's time to get on with it. And 5 years after that Water Act, when John Howard reminded us all that the way in which we manage the basin, especially by the states, has passed its use-by date, his quote, not mine, a lot has changed. And I want to talk about some of that because there has a lot changed. Some things haven't changed. There is, of course, a lot to do. I remain both optimistic and very positive about the prospects for the implementation process, in part because of what's been, but importantly, and having a look at some of the names who are sitting out there, that's because in the last couple of years I've had the great pleasure of working with some very, very big brains on this. I've seen people in the Australian public service, and I mean all jurisdictions, not just the Commonwealth part of the APS, all jurisdictions dedicate themselves and really bring some original thinking to some very difficult problems. And some of them have really had the wisdom of Solomon in this process. It's been a tough policy gig, and indeed some of them have had to have the patience of Job with some of the behaviours and some of the issues they've had to deal with. But this work will pass the test of time. A lot of it, as Peter alluded to in his introduction, is new stuff yet to be tested. But just remember, the science and modelling that sits behind the plan, where we moved from the guide, an end-of-system flow model, a fairly blunt instrument, to a far more sophisticated hydrological model based on assets and functions. Complex is an understatement, and of course an important big shift in thinking. The move into adaptive management required some very detailed work to get that up and away. In part, the concept of an SDL adjustment mechanism is there to reflect the fact that in an adaptive process you have to be able to change based on your evidence. And that's groundbreaking work, and in many ways is yet to be tested again. But the fundamental thinking is critical to having got this far, and will be critical in the future. Even, if I might say, the very concept of environmental water. It really didn't exist all that many years ago. And now we have to think through what are its characteristics, how does it behave against other classes of water that have been around for a century, particularly in a market environment. How is it valued? How do we use it beneficially in a system that's been fundamentally altered to a point where some of the flow regimes in the basin are exactly the mirror reverse of what nature provided for? So the point I'd like to make as a broad general introduction is when you stand away a little bit from the detail and the hard work that so many terrific people have been involved in over the last couple of years, you do see just how big a step change this has been. And Peter did make the point. I do make the point this is just one more step in the never-ending pathway of managing a natural resource base. But put simply, last November, after 5 years of work since the Water Act, and indeed those other two important big step changes in water administration in Australia, the 99 CAP decision and the 2004 NWI, the fact that we as a parliament representing our communities could vote near unanimous to reset the balance of water use in our most important agricultural region was a vote in favour of the long-term health and sustainability of our system and our natural resource base. That's a fundamentally big decision for a government and a parliament to take. And over time, I think we will see the wisdom of that decision. A cap on extractions and real investment in efficiency measures will provide a buffer and protect us from things like climate change and, of course, underpin our sustainability as a trading nation for generations to come. I've only recently returned from the United Nations, where they are working, as many of you know, some of you participating in the development of their Sustainable Development Goals. In many ways, they seek to emulate what we have done. The world, I can assure you from the conversations I had in New York, have truly been watching to a degree of detail which I have to say surprised me. But they have been, and I can report they have been impressed with what they've seen. Their views and the problems nations confront wherever water meets a border underscores that water is a national resource, unambiguously so, and it must be administered in the national interest. Issues of climate change, food security, our future economic prosperity, our long-term sustainability just make that reality, a national resource, just the more so. The work that's been done for the Murray-Darling Basin means we are now better protected against the history and the traditions of what I politely call the interstate myopia when it comes to water administration in Australia. That little YouTube video that you just saw with the two parties pulling at the bucket is not that far from the truth, sadly. We should never, largely because of the work that's gone before and what we can do in implementation, have to face some of the problems that we read about in other parts of the world, China, India, the Mekong Delta. Just reading the other day, the Rio Grande, 90% extractions. 90%. And essentially one nation saying to its neighbour, bad luck for you. Bad luck for you, Mexico. We should not have to face that. If nothing else, our work over the past few years and into the next few years, I think has put some real limits on our ability to wreak havoc on our part of the planet. The salinity, the acid sulfates, the species impact, and I think it also gives us a real opportunity to further improve our place in the world as a high quality, reliable trading partner, especially in food and fibre. More and more we learn to value water for all of its uses, and the structures and processes that have been put in place as part of the plan and the paraphernalia that surrounds the plan, I think are more in place here in Australia in the Murray-Darling Basin than most places in the world. And that's to the credit of, as I said, very many people, many of them public officials working in the governments of the basin. I pay tribute to every single one of you. But now we're about to implement. And since last November, we're back in the bush. It's a very, very, very long list of conversations with towns and mayors and CMAs and chambers of commerce, and frankly, we talk about everything to everybody, not just about water. We want to know as much about what's happening in the high street as we want to know about what's happening in the wetlands. We've deliberately, as an organisation, begun to regionalise in a formal way and localise deliberately in our work planning. We've learnt messages from the bush. We've learnt that there's very little respect in community for macro models, certainly when macro models relate to social and economic impact. People really want to know the detail about their place, their town, their business, and our people are now committed to working with them in their places, in their environments, to develop the baselines and the indicators that will go to informing the plan through its implementation. So, as I said, back in the towns, creating, vanilla videos for school children. We've even got our Director of River Operations, Dave Dreverman, many of you would know Dave, doing a regular ABC radio spot on a fortnightly basis talking about the river and how it works, all in an attempt to sort of, frankly, demystify a bit of this, to let people know that we want to be part of their world rather than them needing to force their way through our door. And the feedback we're getting is very consistent. People are very positive that we're back. I'm surprised I can say that standing here today, but it is the truth, and it's too widespread from the top to the bottom for it not to be just an aberration. I guess the common phrase we now regularly hear is, look, we fought the good fight, we had our say, but now it's time to get on with it. People know there's no magic formula, there's no one-size-fits-all model that will tell us how much impact the Basin Plan will have on their communities, and equally with all the other contributing factors, it's going to be very difficult to sort of disaggregate Basin Plan impact from commodity price impact or other indicators that will have an impact on their town, their business, their industry sector. They get that, they understand it, they aren't fooled by some of the macro messages that have been coming out over the last couple of years from some of the major stakeholder groups. And importantly, they understand that for some of this stuff, as has been the case in the development of the plan, in its implementation, judgment and balance is always going to be essential. Heavily imbued with local knowledge, incorporated into the work. And so we've signed up to that model. We already had, people call it localism, but this is really about engaging with people in ways that mean things to them, and interpreting their needs, their worlds, into information that we can feed back into the processes of government, because in the end, the plan now contemplates an ability to change based on evidence, based on adaptive processes, and the assessment of change ultimately is a matter for the democratically elected part of this equation, the ministers and the parliaments, and we have to provide them with quality information. So for them to make quality decisions, we have to get good information to feed into their processes, hence the way we choose to go about this. So over the next few months, as we build up the set of indicators, we'll continue those local journeys. We'll continue, of course, always to engage in the more set-piece formal dialogues, but important dialogues with the industry leaderships, the industry groups, the environmental groups, and indeed, of course, the state and Commonwealth governments and agencies, and particularly the Commonwealth environmental water holder, not just because it's the obvious thing to do, but also a lot of that work allows us to go beyond the immediate black letter components of the plan into some bigger conversations, which I'll come to later in my remarks, about the future of water administration in Australia, of which the plan forms one important but not the only part. Markets, how you further the opportunity for local engagement, finding ways to build local ownership, creating models of water management that reflect the aspirations of Indigenous communities, for example, who, as you would all know, were sadly, in my view, left out of the thinking in the Water Act, but have, based on the public utterances of our political leadership, an important place in the future of the implementation of the plan, as it should be. Over recent months, there's been some products, which I think some of you would be aware of, but just to cap them off, we've published our first Basin-Wide annual environmental watering priorities. We've produced the technical report which supports the constraints management strategy, which is set for release later this year. November, I think, is the timetable date. We've commenced the Basin-Wide environmental watering strategy, and the Northern Basin review is underway. And there's also been some very good progress in revisiting 3 of the aquifer systems, Western Porous, Eastern Porous Rock in New South Wales, and some of the Victorian fields, as a result of the state's desires to revisit those 3 areas when the decisions were made last November. Over time, we think there's opportunities in each of those areas to further localise decision-making and involvement. I think some of the leads that David Papps, as the new Commonwealth environmental water holder, is providing in how he's engaging with community in decisions about his business of managing the environmental water portfolio are good leads, and those who are interested in localism would be well served to have a look at some of his excellent work. But there are already many examples, as many of you know, in CMAs and water working groups where local entities are already and have been for a long time active in managing water for environmental purposes. So as we move from for want of a better term, a risk-based approach, largely off the back of the drought, into, over the next 7 years, a more strategic framework for environmental watering, there must be scope within that transition to devolve and empower local communities in the management of our river assets. But for now, we're in that build-up phase of our implementation work. As most of you have realised by now, with that up behind me and from what I've been saying, the Basin Plan will be implemented gradually. That's a deliberate decision to allow time for us all to work and manage the required changes. There is no value in trying to shove this into communities unless communities are willing to receive it. They will simply reject it as an antibody reaction. Time is an essential ingredient in this journey. So 2019 remains the date when SDLs come into full enforceable effect. However, 2024 is the date when all the necessary work relating to constraints management and supply and efficiency measures must be complete. In 2016, there will be an opportunity to adjust the SDL to reflect the work that the states are currently developing to achieve SDL offsets. SDL offsets are going to be a phrase you will hear a lot about over the next couple of years. The work is going to be critical if the number, the 2750 you hear about, is to be able to be adjusted either up or down. You know that New South Wales and Victoria want to adjust the number down from 2750 to 2100. South Australia wants to adjust the number up from 2750 to 3200. Now, that seemingly impossible divide is to be resolved during the next 2 years by the application of a science-based methodology, which will be known as the SDL adjustment mechanism. During the next 2 years, states, in my simple terms, get to put all of their offset projects into the black box, and rather than just say, wave the magic wand, bibbidi-bobbidi-boo, and out comes a new number, there will be a process of assessment which the authority undertakes. We have to assess those projects, turn them into a volumetric equivalent, and then advise the Minister, Commonwealth Minister, who then determines whether the SDL is adjusted by 2750 or some other number. Ultimately, the Parliament has a right to scrutinise that decision, and so, as you might expect me to say, and as will be the case, that process will be highly transparent and able to be validated at every turn. It won't be the magic black box and the hocus pocus. It will be an exposed process as it should be. Clearly, that's going to be a tough task, but it's important for me to remind this audience and every audience the fallback position remains where we presently are. The plan has been made, the number remains 2750 and will remain so unless there's good reason to change it. At the same time as that work's going on, we're looking at constraints in the system, a different body of work, and the we, when I say we're looking at, in that case is the Murray-Darling Basin Authority working in close consultation with the states and community, because there's wisdom out there in the community about their local parts of the system. The work at first blush appears to be about physical constraints, but it also contemplates policy and operational constraints, the so-called rules of water management in the Murray-Darling Basin. As Tony Windsor pointed out in the context of his parliamentary inquiry, there are literally thousands upon thousands of water management rules, multi-jurisdictional, often perverse, often at cross purposes, and generally have been designed, quite legitimately, no argument with this, to reflect the primacy of consumptive use over the needs of environmental use. Remember I said, it wasn't all that long ago when the concept of environmental water didn't exist. Well, the whole rule books have been about how you manage water for consumptive use. And the constraints have to consider how we begin to bring environmental water into play and where there are opportunities for more efficient use of water through changes to the constraints in the system. So next year, based on what I said earlier, us publishing a constraints management strategy at the back end of this year will be a test for the states to decide what, if anything, they want to do about constraints. There's government money in the pot for them to do things, but this will be a tough call for them. In fact, I suspect the concept of jacking up bridges and buying easements will be the sort of the easier part of the spectrum, as tough as that might be. You know, when you get into the rules changes, you're starting to affect issues around the asset worth of farmers. Their water licences are worth money, and you have to be very, very careful. In fact, I liken it to like handling a test tube of nitroglycerin. You make one drop here and the whole thing will explode. But these are conversations that have to be had if we're all serious about better water use. And in the end, I believe, based on my experience over a few years now, that it's going to be a conversation about market behaviour and price that will be where the breakthrough areas come, and that will secure a better outcome for water use efficiency, be it for consumptive or environmental uses. It's why, for example, I've been encouraging over the last couple of years the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder to develop a trading profile for their environmental water. It's essential they participate into the rest of the market in an active way. Because until e-water is a commodity in its own right, it will always have a surrogate value. It will always be a mimic class of water. Unless there's a real value rather than a surrogate value, it cannot and therefore will not be able to take its place alongside other current and long-standing consumptive classes. That needs to happen as a precursor so that rules changes can occur as a result of rational market demands rather than governments seeking to shoehorn change in on rules in ways that will be seen by the productive communities, the farming communities, as favouring the environment ahead of people, affecting their reliability and bringing, of course, with it, as it should, claims for compensation as the asset values of their consumptive licence are impacted. So unless you create a market framework here where current market participants are comfortable and can work within it, you are always going to have that conflict of trying to push another class of water in if it's done in the wrong way. So they're the building blocks of the next level of sophistication in Australian water policy. They are in many ways conversations of the future, but I choose to raise them here today because I think they're logical future steps as we move through the implementation plan. So the plan and its implementation represents some big changes and some very real hope for the future. And of course, though, as I said earlier, some things haven't changed. And I want to cover off on a couple of those things because it's an important opportunity for a chairman to make a point and express a view. For example, each state still asserts that they have the best system of water administration. And I preface what I'm about to say by making the point I was as guilty as a former state water minister in that assertion as any of the current crop of ministers. You defend your turf. And whilst there may be some truth in those views, the bigger overarching truth is they can't all be right, at least not at the same time. And I guess with the benefit of a bit of hindsight and hopefully a bit more, turns around the track, a little bit more wisdom, I would like to think. I really now think it's beyond doubt, as evidenced by everything from sort of the political end, the Senate inquiries, the House of Reps inquiries, through to the research projects and everything in between, that if nothing else, the sum of each part does not come even close to equaling the needs of the whole, when the whole you're talking about is the needs of the Murray-Darling Basin. The multiplicity of rules, the cross-border dialogue, the internalised debates, they seem endless and they really do act as a handbrake and create perverse and negative effects. In short, we really do make things much harder than they need to be, and the river and the communities who live on it and live off it are poorer as a result. Each state, of course, wants to protect their rights, but it sometimes feels like it's as if the national interest was something akin to sort of an unwelcome intruder into a private exclusive club. What are you doing here? Now, I don't assert that our plan is the be-all and end-all. I really do say it's a logical step in a process, a big step nonetheless. But it does, in taking that big step, do many things to ensure that old club can't and won't be the same again. But for our plan to be successful, it has to be more than just different, it has to be better. It should allow for adaptation and change, not just to the multiple layers. It should really create opportunities to go beyond the immediate confines of the plan to further develop water policy, to build on the work of the NWI, and I especially note the areas of trade, market sophistication, the equalisation of titling registers, and as previously mentioned, the development of environmental water in its own right as its own class rather than as a surrogate. We need to do that because ultimately this needs to be something we all do rather than something that the governments do. Whilst ever this is a government implemented plan, whilst ever it remains in that sort of mind space, it will be very difficult to create the degree of ownership that I think is necessary for this to be an endemic way of life for the way we behave as an Australian community when we manage our natural resource base. Done properly, a functioning market drives efficiency of use and properly costs the resource. Farmers, of course, understand this better than most. They work in global markets. They understand tariff walls came down years ago, and they understand that despite there being winners and losers, we are by and large better off as a consequence. And as markets continue to sophisticate in water, the straw man arguments that you hear a lot about now, that have been around for a few years and are sort of rearing their head again right at the moment, in my view, simply get blown away. You know, the arguments about caps on trade, the notional state shares for contribution to downstream flows that are in the plan. I have very little doubt that in time these things will come to be seen as little more than interesting artefacts, necessary only because they let us get to somewhere. But let me be very clear, it's my view that they're little more than a political diversion. They are not necessarily good policy. The truth is, irrigators, or at least their representatives, their peak bodies, demanded the separation of water from land title. They did so in the context of the National Water Initiative, and by and large, I'm here to tell you they got what they wanted. They wanted the ability to trade. They wanted to be able to treat water as a commodity. They wanted to be compensated if any future government ever tried to compulsorily acquire their water right. And I have no doubt, because frankly I was there in the conversations, that they knew what they were asking for. They weren't naive. They wanted an opportunity to access a new business using a very old product, water, with the inevitable risks that brings. But sadly, all these years later, for some, they still want to have the cake and eat it too. Well, I guess there's a bloke called Paul Keating once said, always back that horse called self-interest, at least you know it's trying. And in this case, self-interest is coming to the fore. I call them the Caps on Trade Brigade. They're made up of an unholy alliance of political expedience and those who variously demand a cessation to buyback and demand that the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder get out of the market. Government shouldn't be in this market, almost again as if they're sort of an unwelcome visitor to an exclusive club, a rogue trader. We've got to be very vigilant about this stuff. We've got to put a very loud bell on this cat so we can hear it when it moves. Organisations such as the ACCC, the National Water Commission, the trade agencies, certainly Commonwealth and State Treasuries, the Productivity Commission, and frankly the irrigators themselves, who have more to gain and more to lose if this is handled well or badly, need to consider the implications of those who argue for a constrained market by even more state regulation or the artificial removal of market participants. For example, when Tony Burke, in a concession to Southern Connected System irrigators, the Murrumbidgee-Murray-Goulburn system, stopped general tendering a couple of years ago, you would recall that, the inevitable happened. Water prices fell. And you couldn't quite hear the screams from here, but people didn't like that. Some of the people who didn't like them were the people who asked for the purchasing to stop. Historically, and I go back a bit further in this, when trade restrictions existed as a result of the dowry arrangements, when Nick Greiner privatised the New South Wales irrigation districts, it wasn't just the Victorian side of the border that complained about limits on trade. Indeed, it was many of the members of those irrigation districts themselves who saw it as an unnecessary and unreasonable fetter on their business. And so, logically and inevitably, artificial restrictions have been and continue to be removed. Somewhere up there, water trading rules begin. The governments have agreed to remove trade restrictions this time next year, 1 year from now. Nonetheless, right now, a year in advance of what has been agreed, New South Wales is arguing for a buyback limit, effectively a cap on trade of no more than 3% a decade reduction from the consumptive pool. 3% a decade from their consumptive pool. In my view, this runs counter to the interests of irrigators and regional communities. The 3% per decade target can actually easily be achieved if New South Wales does what it says it wants to do and brings forward sufficient projects for assessment under the SDL adjustment process. On a state share basis, that work, together with water already acquired, will allow the target to be met. The only risk of New South Wales not meeting their target is if they don't sign the intergovernmental agreement. Signing the intergovernmental agreement allows money to flow from Canberra to the bush. It's already flowing in Victoria and South Australia, who have signed the agreement. By not signing, New South Wales risks missing out. The clock is ticking, of course it is, but as that agreed program shows, the clock stops in 2016. The agreement that the states negotiated and which was agreed with the Commonwealth allows 650 gigalitres of the 2,750 gigalitres to be obtained notionally through SDL offsets. That is a replacement of buyback with projects. But the same agreement makes it equally clear that buyback will be used to make up the shortfall to 2,750 if there are insufficient projects in the 650 GL portion. I stress this is what the states negotiated. It was a concept inspired by Peter Walsh. I was there when he presented it, and everyone signed on. It's where the SDL adjustment mechanism came from. The whole concept came from that conversation. You will recall that their work replaced what we proposed, and that was for a simple mid-term review. It allowed New South Wales to go to their communities and either say 2,750 meant 2,100 or 3,200. So whilst it may be politically cute to demand a buyback limit, the reality is that the agreement requires states to perform on SDL offsets, or buyback becomes the residual option. New South Wales irrigators and regional towns and communities need to understand that the Basin Plan is now law and the number is 2,750 gigalitres. A failure to sign the IGA by New South Wales does not change that number, not by one drop. All it means is that there is less opportunity for them to access real money to do offset projects and system improvements, and the increased likelihood of buyback if New South Wales fails to deliver on its part of the plan. I'm not surprised, therefore, as we engage with regional communities and towns and mayors, that more and more people, as they realise the implications of what this is about, including people in places like Griffith and Leeton, I might add, are saying to the government, sign the agreement, let's access the Commonwealth's money, let's invest in our towns and our communities, let's make this plan work for us rather than against us, let's get on with it. Let's get on with it. To those people who are urging the New South Wales government to not sign the IGA and to set artificial caps on trade, I say this with all sincerity, you're simply wrong. You're simply wrong. Be careful, be very careful of what you wish for. My track record on this stuff is pretty clear. You know, I worked with John Anderson on the NWI. and I work with Tony Burke on this plan. I think I can claim some credit in steering the government away from perhaps an over-reliance on buyback to a model which regarded balance as important and regarded people and economic imperatives as critical in achieving a good balance between long-term environmental health and the resilience of our natural systems, and of course the need for productive and contributing communities. I'm here to tell you, mucking around with water markets will in the long run hurt irrigators. Failing to take the opportunity to invest in future-proofing our country, our food and fibre producing regions, investing in efficiency and diversity will hurt us all. Just after 2 years ago, when I became the chairman of the authority, the argument back then, you'll all remember it, was about the blunt instrument of buyback and of course the inadequacy of the Water Act in terms of its alleged bias of environmental imperatives over any other matter. Back then I remember saying very clearly over and over and over again that I saw no impediment in the Act that would prevent me from seeking to balance social, economic and environmental considerations, optimising them in making the Basin Plan. I think it would now be a tragedy having shifted a government, having shifted a debate into a space that met the demands of what community wanted. Listen to us and invest in us, stop just taking water out of us, if for nothing more than short-sighted and very poorly analysed political manoeuvring, that people on the land were to be disadvantaged in their ability to access much-needed Commonwealth funding. I know the states don't have the money, the Commonwealth has put the money on the table. If that number is to change because of investment, it's only going to come from one place. If it doesn't flow, the number doesn't change, and we are where we are. Now, I just make the point, the Commonwealth Government has invested billions of dollars into this exercise. We all know there are very major competing demands on scarce resources: health, national disability, education, and many, many, many other demands. I happen to think this is a worthwhile investment. The whole retooling of our capacity as a nation to produce food and fibre, to participate in the world, to underpin the health of our environmental assets will be a good investment and a lasting legacy. And of course, people aren't obliged to sell water. That furphy hopefully has been done away with forever. There is no compulsory acquisition here. And the evidence is very clear that people do want to sell their water when it's appropriate for them to do so. And putting artificial constraints on that, I think, as I said, will hurt irrigators first and will, in the long term, hurt us all. So in many ways, I think those who argue for the caps, the artificialities of constraints, are singing an old song. In many ways, since the guide and those early days and what exists now and how we're implementing this is now a story of investing in rather than taking from rural and regional Australia. So all in all, I think, despite some of those niggly things and the vagaries of sort of current political environments and all those sorts of things that we all have to deal with as a community, things are going pretty well. We've learnt from our mistakes. We continue to get better as a result. I think it's fair for me to assert that we've done more than most people realise. And of course, there's still much, much more to be done. We've still got to continue the sophistication of those water markets. There's good stuff happening through COAG on trade exemptions and water intermediaries. The work on the titling register, while slower than I would like, is marching inevitably to a logical conclusion which will give the finance sectors the confidence to be able to see water as a tradable and proper commodity with the security it deserves. It'll only be 160 years after Robert Torrens did the same thing for land, but better late than never, I guess. I think we'll be hearing in the very, very near future, hopefully as early as this afternoon or tomorrow, the decision to conduct a productivity commission study into the important componentry around how the assets of the basin, the dams, the locks and weirs will be funded in the future and managed in the future, given the rather extraordinary decision by the New South Wales government to cut its funding unilaterally a year or so ago, leaving native fish strategies and sustainable rivers audits, which go to monitoring and evaluation, in nowhere land, and many of the assets not properly structured in terms of a rational framework for administration and maintenance. So, as I said, more to be done and more to be learnt. Though thus far, in conclusion, I think I'd leave you with the things we probably have learnt thus far, some important lessons. First of all, science and evidence are critical in this journey. You can't move without science and evidence, but frankly, without community support, they are not enough, and we've seen that. Policymakers must look at the totality of the picture, not the sectional interests. Striking a balance is important, not because it's sort of a lowest common denominator, because it helps underpin the aspirations of each sector. If everyone's doing well, we all rise as a consequence. Time and a chance for people to adapt to change allows people to come to terms with new ways and to join in on the journey. The next lesson is people count. In many ways, everything I've ever done in public policy making is not about the subject area, it's about people. Whether it was health policy or forestry or native veg, being able to recognise that people have a right and policymakers, as a consequence, have an obligation to incorporate their views as best as is possible, or be straight with them when it's not possible, is, I think, if nothing else, a decent thing to do, but it underpins the sustainability of the policy work in the long run. The next to last is, of course, never waste a crisis. Crises create urgency and the sense we've got to do something. They make people sometimes drop their guard. They sort of make you jink to the left when you should have jinked to the right. And John Howard didn't waste a crisis. Millennium drought. And the work we've done in many ways is rooted, in recent times, is rooted back there, but some of those other big step changes, similarly. Blue-green algae, acid sulfate, salt, we've got to do something. And so the repatriation of some authority to the Commonwealth to participate in this game was off the back of a crisis. No bad thing. Sustaining it will not be about crisis management, it will be about common sense and incorporating some of these things. And the last one, and it's the one that I think I probably started with in my opening remarks, and it does go to some of the remarks I made about some of the myopia that I've witnessed along the journey, and that is simply leadership and bipartisan behaviour are essential ingredients. I was around for the 99 cap decision. I was around in 2004 with the NWI, and I witnessed a great partnership in Tony Burke and Peter Walsh this time around, and I also referenced other senior politicians on both sides of the political divide in my opening remarks. Without them deciding to do something good, that extraordinary brain power, that extraordinary task of original thinking that so many people contributed to could have easily come to zero. And so, as a person who's as interested in change management and management function as I am in other areas of policy, I nail to the wall the last point of learning, and that is always create environments where bipartisanship and leadership can populate. Because in the end, as all those negotiations continue about money and trade and rules, and we have to always remember that this is about leadership, because, as Tony Burke said on the day he signed into law a plan for the Murray-Darling Basin in November 2012, he said this: the toughest negotiator of all is the environment. If we get it wrong, the environment simply walks away from the table and leaves nothing behind. Our leaders have to remember those words as we move over the next 7 years into this piece of work that's up behind me. I'm confident they will. They've already signalled as much through that vote in the Parliament and their words since. In that sense, I thank them for their efforts. I thank all of you for your efforts. And I conclude by saying thank you.